Athens, the ancient city found on the Attic Peninsula and the present-day capital of Greece. Her history dates back over 3,000 years. In the ancient world, Athens was a bastion of philosophy, learning, and the arts. Some have named her the cradle of Western civilization, where Europe's civilizational brilliance began. She's also considered the birthplace of democracy. Throughout the history of European civilization, the greatness of Athens has been praised for its advances in human intellect. But its system of democratic rule has had a very different historiography. For 2,000 years following Philip of Macedon's conquest of Athens in 338 BC, democracy was seen as a destructive system of government. It was not until after the Enlightenment of the 18th century that a new favorable view of democracy emerged in the West. And it was not until after the Second World War that this became accepted as the supposed best system of government. Now, anyone familiar with my work knows that I am a bigger critic than any of the liberal democratic system, which is upheld with almost religious fervor today as an absolute and universal good. And a major influence on my skepticism of the system was the critiques made by pre-Enlightenment thinkers dating back to the ancients. Nonetheless, I do believe that there is something to be learned from how the ancient Athenians conceived of their city-state and the value that they placed on the democratic franchise. There's a somewhat obscure story that I came across while watching a video lecture by the historian Donald Kagan at Yale University on classical era Greece, which can be found on YouTube. Though this story was presented in an apolitical manner, it has become one of the most influential historical events on my political views because for me, it punched a hole in my trust of liberal democracy in the modern world, so I think it's worth sharing. But before we get to the story, I'll need to give some background into how Athenian democracy worked. The polis of Athens was originally an aristocracy, but developed into a democracy in the 6th century BC. The development of democracy in Athens started with the reforms of Solon, who was the first to impart political rights upon Athenian citizens, which allowed them to partake in assembly meetings. The democratic constitution of Athens was officially adopted in 508 BC under the rule of Cleisthenes. The constitution granted the franchise to all citizens of Athens. A citizen was an Athenian man over the age of 20 who had completed their military training. All citizens had the right to attend assembly meetings, speak, and vote on issues. The government was comprised of several different bodies, and some citizens were more active than others. Athens was a direct democracy, not a representative one like we have today, meaning citizens would vote on particular issues, not for politicians. Now, it's important to note that the assembly had jurisdiction over all of Attica, but not all of the population of Attica was Athenian. During the classical period, the population of Attica was estimated to be between 250,000 and 300,000 people. Of that, between a half and a third of them were Athenians. The number of Athenian men with citizenship fluctuated between 30,000 and 60,000 during the classical period. So the citizen population was between 10 and 20% of the population of Attica. So who lived in Attica other than Athenians? First, there were slaves who obviously didn't have citizenship. It's worth noting that in Athens, the slave population was not nearly as large as a state like Sparta's, and they were not treated nearly as brutally as the Spartans treated the Helots. It was common for a family to have 1 or 2 slaves, and they would often act as more employees than chattel slaves. It was common for an Athenian man to work the fields alongside his slaves, or in some cases, the slaves might even run a business for their master. They couldn't own property, but some masters allowed slaves to save up money to buy their freedom, but slaves could not become citizens. Another group of residents of Attica that did not hold citizenship were referred to as metics. A metic was a foreign resident of Athens. They were either an immigrant to Athens from another city-state, or former slaves who had been given freedom. Male metics shared the same responsibility as citizens, but did not hold the same political rights as Athenian men. They were subject to military service and taxation, but they were not allowed to participate or vote in the assembly. They made up around a third of the population of classical Athens. So this is how ancient Athenian democracy worked. It was a direct democracy of Athenian men, the citizens of Athens. So this story takes place shortly after the end of the Golden Age of Athens. Athens reached the height of its power in the mid-5th century BC, following years of wars against the Persian Empire. This was known as the Athenian Golden Age. Athens was the leading polis in an alliance of city-states known as the Delian League. Its strength was challenged by the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta. The Delian League and the Peloponnesian League clashed in the late 5th century BC on the Peloponnesian War. The war lasted for decades with intermittent peace and hostility, but resulted in a victory for Sparta and the Peloponnesian League in 404 BC. With their defeat, the Delian League was dissolved and Sparta claimed dominance over Athens and her allies. With Athens under his control, the Spartan statesman Lysander dissolved the Athenian democracy and installed a pro-Spartan oligarchy made up of 30 oligarchs, led by a former student of Socrates named Critias. This government became known as the 30 Tyrants. Now it's important to note that in ancient Greece, a government was considered a tyranny if it ruled outside the purview of the constitution. Monarchies or aristocracies were not necessarily tyrannies if they ruled according to the constitution of their polis. And a democracy could be considered tyrannical if it was outside the constitution. The 30 tyrants were in fact tyrants because their rule over Athens was illegitimate. It was imposed upon them by Sparta. Now, Athens was torn because on one hand, they were ruled by an illegitimate oligarchy, but on the other, they had just lost the Peloponnesian War, and many Athenians blamed the loss on the weakness of the democratic system. So Athens was divided between a pro-democracy faction and a faction loyal to the 30 tyrants. The tyrants deprived all but 3,000 men of their rights as citizens who would help them run the government. They began a reign of terror against their political opponents in which 1,500 people are said to have been executed without trial. Many opponents of Critias and the tyrants fled Athens and went into exile. One of the first opponents of the oligarchy was a Peloponnesian war general named Thrasybulus. Thrasybulus, a supporter of the democracy, was forced to flee Athens and go into exile in Thebes. While in Thebes, Thrasybulus was joined by more and more exiles who had fled Athens, fearing for their lives. The Thebans assisted Thrasybulus in putting together a force which would be used to retake Athens from the 30 tyrants. Thrasybulus led a force of 70 men to capture the fortress of Phyle near the border of Attica. With the oligarchy becoming more and more vicious in suppressing political dissidents, and the news of Thrasybulus' effort to liberate Athens, more exiles left the city to join Thrasybulus' force. His forces grew to 700 men. It's important to note that the majority of Thrasybulus' force was not made up of Athenians, but of medics. As I mentioned before, these were either foreign residents of Athens or former slaves. They were not citizens of Athens, meaning that they were fighting to restore a democracy that they did not have the right to vote in. A number of mercenaries also joined his force, for whom the same would apply. This will play an important role later in the story. With a resistance mounting, the 30 tyrants and their Spartan supporters sent out an expedition force to crush the rebellion. They sent the Spartan garrison stationed in Athens, accompanied by Athenian cavalry, out to eliminate Thrasybulus and his forces in Phyle. But Thrasybulus launched a surprise attack on their camp, killing 120 Spartans and forcing the rest to retreat. After his victory, Thrasybulus' forces grew even larger as more exiles joined him. He took a force of 1,000 men to capture Munychia, a hill overarching the Athenian port of Piraeus. He left 200 men to defend the fortress of Phyle. The 30 tyrants again sent out their forces accompanied by their Spartan allies to destroy Thrasybulus and his army of exiles. This time Thrasybulus' forces were greatly outnumbered, but their superior position atop the hill gave them a victory in the Battle of Munychia. Several leaders of the oligarchy, including Critias himself, were killed in the battle. The remaining tyrants were forced to flee to Eleusis. With Critias dead, the tyrants on the run, and a rebellion rising, Athens descended into chaos. With revolution mounting, the remaining oligarchs, unable to deal with Thrasybulus, pleaded to the Spartans to send reinforcements. The Peloponnesian League sent an expedition to put an end to Thrasybulus' rebellion. The Spartans narrowly were able to defeat Thrasybulus and his Athenian exiles at the Battle of Piraeus. But luckily for the pro-democracy forces, Lysander had been replaced by the far less aggressive King Pausanias of Sparta. With Athens falling apart, rather than crush the rebellion, Pausanias opted to reconcile the division in Athens and bring the entire polis into an alliance with Sparta. Thrasybulus and his men were permitted to return to the city. In 403, after a year of oligarchical rule, democracy was restored in Athens. In return, it was agreed that all 3,000 involved with the oligarchy, except for the 30 tyrants themselves, would be granted amnesty. For his actions, Athens awarded Thrasybulus the olive crown, and the Athenian democracy would last until Athens fell to Philip of Macedon in 338 BC. Now, the lesson I learned from this story comes from a decision made shortly after the democracy was restored in 403 BC. This decision is only a footnote in this chaotic episode in the history of Athens, but nonetheless, it was one of the most impactful events on my own political views. Historian Donald Kagan said that this decision epitomized how much passion the Athenians had for their polis, and I believe that it sheds light on some true wisdom that we could learn from today. I had mentioned that a large portion of Thrasybulus' army who fought to restore the democracy were metics. This meant that they were not Athenians themselves, meaning they were not citizens, which meant that they could not vote in the democracy that they fought to restore. Once the revolt had come to an end and the democracy was reinstituted, when Thrasybulus himself requested that these men who had fought to liberate Athens be granted Athenian citizenship, the Athenian people voted no. Now why? Were they not thankful to these men? Was sharing the right to vote not the least they could do for men who had fought to restore to the citizens of Athens that very right? Even after a request from Thrasybulus, the hero of Athens? Because the sovereignty of Athens was in the Athenian citizens themselves. They were Athens, and Athens was them. Of course, they were thankful that their own political rights were restored, but even for someone who had given them so much, the idea that a non-Athenian could ever become a citizen and decide the future of Athens was completely unacceptable. Though Athens was a democracy, these were the standards that the Athenians held in order to preserve their civilizational greatness. The Athenian citizenship was the reins to the brilliance of Athens, and they would only ever hand that over to one of their own. When I read the history of other great nations and empires and how they fell, their decline is often accompanied by a loss of standards. In his essay titled Fate of Empires, Sir John Glubb outlines the symptoms that once great empires show when they're in their dying days. One of these he identifies is that citizenship becomes cheap. At an empire's height, the citizenship is invaluable. It is only given to the founding stock who are fully invested in the maintenance of the empire. But then the equality of mankind is proclaimed and citizenship is given to more people, often even conquered peoples. As citizenship is extended to more and more peoples, newcomers are less loyal to the empire and less motivated to maintain it. Eventually, citizenship means nothing. According to Glubb, this is a sign that a once great empire is coming to its end. He points out that when the Roman Empire was on the decline, Roman citizenship was granted to all free subjects across the provinces. Eventually, those occupying political office from the provinces no longer held the same loyalty to Rome. Glubb also points out that the same took place as the Arab Empire of Baghdad was in its dying days. As they experienced an influx of foreigners, positions once held by Arabs were granted to outsiders who, likewise, were not as committed to the empire's survival. This story from ancient Athens also makes me question the manner that democracy is run in the Western world today. While the Athenians would only ever allow a member of their brotherhood to take part in their system of democracy, we are far more generous in who we hand the franchise to in ours. All you need is a sticker on your passport and we let you decide the future of our nations. Your loyalty to our civilization is inconsequential. We give it to everyone. All you have to do is just be born here and turn 18 and then you get the right to vote, even if your parents entered the country illegally. Or you just have to move here, stay 4 or 5 years, and you can get full citizenship granted. We don't take into account people's historical connection to our nations, their contributions, what they have at stake, or even if they have any interest in the continuation of our civilization. These are the only standards that we have. I wonder what the men of Athens would think of that. Sir John Glubb argued in his essay that great nations and empires could avoid their eventual downfall if they studied not only their own history, but the history of the human race. One of the dangers he warned of was this lack of standards, that if citizenship became cheap, those running your empire will not be committed to its survival and it will eventually die. Are we bound to repeat this same mistake yet again? So what can we learn from this story from ancient Athenian democracy? Is it a lesson about democracy? I don't think it is. I think it's a lesson about sovereignty and responsibility. I myself am a skeptic of democracy, but what I truly admire about the Athenian people was their dedication to their own sovereignty. That even for men who had liberated their polis from the reign of a brutal tyranny, they could not compromise on the principle that only Athenians could ever decide the future of Athens. And to our modern liberal sentiments, this may seem bigoted or authoritarian. But when I read the history of how civilizations fell in the past, and I look at who our nation's allowed to decide our future, I have to ask, are these people committed to the preservation of our civilization? Sir John Glubb said that we can avoid the mistakes of the past which caused the downfall of great empires by studying the wider history of the human race. Perhaps for us, the inheritors of Western civilization, in our study of the world, maybe somewhere in the footnotes of an ancient civilization long gone, there is true wisdom to be found. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, or subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can now do so. Links are down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.